Hello and welcome to the Wednesday, April 3rd edition of the Cluster API office hours. Adding a link to the chat right now for the people attending in real time. Please go ahead and add your name to the attending list. And if you have any items that you want to bring up on the agenda, go ahead and please add them there as well. To start off today, we have an announcement that we have finally released V1 Alpha 1 last Friday. We cut the official 0.1.0 release of Cluster API. So that's been a little over a year in the making. So congratulations and thank you to everybody who helped make that happen. It's been a long road and we finally hit that milestone. So next on the agenda, looks like Tim has a PSA he wants to share.
So for many of the for a while that we want image stamping, providers need to do this. There is always the option to exit out, but we want to give and it's kind of dedupe the problem set that exists across a number of different providers of creating a canonical tool for image stamping. And we opened this issue a while ago. Basically, if you look at across the providers, there are several different things that are being done. So what I'm going to try to do in the next week or so is to create a spec for the work. As we've mentioned before, we've mentioned this several times in the past, but it is clearly out of scope for Cluster API, but it is also Cluster API is a primary consumer. So it's possible that for iteration, have it live with the Cluster API repository until we get enough eyeballs on it, enough requirements in place that it can live on its own. So I wanted to give a PSA at that. If you want to be involved in the requirements and documentation of that stuff, please hit me up on Slack and I'll get a spec going.
Question. Does this effort preclude, maybe a different effort for actually doing software, having a common software provisioning layer in the cluster API reference implementation?
Preclude? No. It might be the default, but it doesn't mean that it won't allow folks, and we won't allow folks to do whatever they want to do. We do want to make it easy for the common use case. So follow the standard like Kubernetes mantra, which is like make it super easy for the 80% use case, but also allow that 20% use case to have a clean exit strategy.
So somebody, that's not. So is this a use case that will, or sorry, is this an approach that's going to work exclusively on cloud's infrastructure APIs?
No.
It's just,
so
yeah.
I think what Daniel's getting at is we're talking about building images, which could be Pixie booted either from a cloud environment or an on-premises environment, depending. And he's wondering about the case, what if we actually have no way to Pixie boot? Can we still, what do we do? And so one answer is don't use the packager. Another answer is, and this could be a requirement that we have when we have a packing discussion, an image stamping discussion, is can the same scripts which are used to build the image be used to deploy Kubernetes on a running system?
That's entirely possible. That's a good environment to have. Yeah, I like it. If you want to have, instead of spike shedding to Slack, and we can start a doc in a separate discussion on this, I think that would be.
I couldn't hear you. Did you say Slack, or do you want me to add something to the issue?
Hit me up on Slack if you want to be part of it. I'll start to get a doc, and then we can actually coordinate that way.
All right. Anything else on that topic before we go ahead and move on? No? All right, next up is Justin with normalization of user input.
Yes, thank you. So this actually came up via a PR. I don't know if the author of the PR is here, but the seems really trivial, but bear with me because I think it goes to a broader point. The Kubernetes version as specified in, if I recall correctly, the machine deployment machine set, there's a debate about whether it should have a V in the front of it. And I think we currently require it not to have a V in front of it. So it has to be 1.14.0 as opposed to v1.14.0. And if you type v1.14.0, it doesn't, like the scripts don't work. The question is whether we want, this arises in a number of places, similar sort of things arise in a number of places in terms of sanitization or normalization of inputs. And I guess the question is, do we want to, first of all, I don't think, we could obviously just merge the PR in the cloud provider API, in CapG, cloud provider API GCP, but it would be weird to have, for example, AWS require a V and GCP require not a V and OpenStack to like need something else entirely. So I feel like this is something we should agree at the top level. And as I see it, the options are that we are fairly liberal and we accept either V or not V and just normalize, or that we implement validation and are strict and require you to specify without the V, if that's one we want. I can't remember. It doesn't really matter whether it's either without the V or with the V, whatever we choose, but we require one particular form. The trade-off being in my mind, and I'm sure there are other options, so the trade-off being in my mind whether if we are liberal and we accept V and not V, then every other consumer of the API will also have to have the same normalization logic, whereas if we are strict, they will not, but it is a little harsher on users. And but if we have a webhook that enforces validation, it's not the end of the world. So that's what I wanted to sort of raise to sort of, so we can get some of those PRs merged in the GCP provider.
So I think there's one other option, Justin, in that we might be able to normalize using like a mutating webhook as well.
Yes. So in other words, if I typed a v1.14.0, it would appear as 1.14 as without the V.
Right, or the other way
yes.
around, whichever way we decide to standardize.
But my fear with that is that it then may confuse apply, or like the idea that I apply something and I get something different. I don't know if we have other examples of that, but it is definitely a third possibility. You're right.
Yeah.
What does kubeadm support?
I'm guessing this requirement comes from kubeadm. So in other words, whether it's a V or not V, whichever one it is.
Okay.
Or does anyone know? Because I think we just passed this through to kubeadm.
It's the standard version string, I believe, which includes the V.
With the V. Okay, I probably got it the wrong way around then. But I
So
guess
actually, V is not Semver, but Kubernetes assumes V. And yeah, I feel like V should be optional in almost all code that I've seen written, because the Semver standard does not allow V. When the user passes a V, which is default Kubernetes, in order to use a Semver library that is compliant, you have to write specific code to drop the V, and you have to do that every time you use the Semver, or every time you accept input. So I think we should just normalize in the beginning to drop the V, and then internally treat version numbers without the V, or vice versa. I mean, I don't care which direction we become consistent, but Kubernetes does not follow the Semver standard here, because the Semver standard is wrong according to some people.
And you were opting for writing back the normalized version, or into the API, or just internally treating it normalized?
I'm for normalizing it.
internally without.
Meaning you either add the V always. Yeah. Say it again, Justin.
Sorry, I interrupted you. I thought you were. I was just asking you to clarify.
I'm for normalizing it, and I think we can either keep the V or don't keep the V. But internally, if you use the Semver library, you can't have the V.
I think this might be something that would be better discussed as part of the mini caps for the features once we get into V1 Alpha 2 after the goals and requirements and use cases refinements. I would love to see this in a common singular default implementation that can work across all providers, all infrastructure providers. So would it be okay if we recognize that we need to solve this, but make sure we do it as part of the new KEP process?
Right. I think that's fine. I think that is also a fair thing to write on the PR. I wanted to have something to respond to the PR. I think that's a good idea. And I think this actually arises, I think there were like 3 or 4 that were similar. This was the sort of simplest to reason about, I think.
Right.
Or whether I remembered which way around the V was. But yeah, I think what you proposed makes a ton of sense, Andy.
All right. Andy, do you want me to solicit any other topics before we move on to the goals and requirements and use cases?
Yeah.
Or
that would be good if there's anything else.
all right. Does anybody else have any other topics to bring up before we move on to the goals, requirements, and use cases? Nope. All right.
Thanks, Jason.
Over to you, Andy.
So as I'm assume most of you are aware, we have 2 documents now, one for goals and requirements and a second one for use cases. We would strongly like to be able to get lazy consensus agreement on the goals and requirements within the next 2 days by Friday. And I would encourage everyone to go review these 2 documents. Please add comments, questions, suggestions if things don't make sense or if you think something's missing. And what we would like to do is take the goals and requirements document as it stands on Friday and begin to take the content that is there and shift it over to the cluster API KEP in the Kubernetes enhancements repository as an update to that KEP, which I believe was originally authored in January of 2018. So we do want to get that updated, and we will open up a pull request for the KEP, and then everyone will be invited to comment on that as well. But hopefully we can get through most of the commentary beforehand, and then once the KEP has been updated and the PR has been merged, we will begin the planning process for what's in and out of scope for V1 Alpha 2. And we'll be splitting up into as many groups as are necessary to work on each of the individual features, which, as a reminder, we do want to do KEPs for each of those. And we're going to suggest that rather than putting the cluster API KEPs for features in the Kubernetes enhancements repository, we'd like to put them in the cluster API repository itself. It keeps them closer to the project, and it's just this SIG that's responsible for reviewing and approving them. So hopefully everybody is okay with doing that rather than putting them in the enhancements repo. And I don't necessarily have anything else for this meeting to go over with these documents. Just to reiterate, please review them and add comments.
Hey, Andy, the requirements and the use case, is anybody going, who's responsible for making sure that there's a requirements for every use case?
I would ask that whoever wrote each use case make the best effort to see that they map to one or more requirements. Hopefully that's fair.
So I have a question about that. Do we have to have a requirement for every use case?
I'm tempted to say not necessarily, but without seeing a specific use case that doesn't map back to a requirement and what the implications might or might not be, it's hard to speak in generalities.
Also recognize that this is an update, and I fully expect that over time we will approach what we all agree is consensus. So if we update now, it seems totally reasonable that we might want to modify or update in the future. But this gives us some guide rails to probably for the conversations that we have.
Sure. So the reason I mention it is there's one specific requirement which I feel like is unnecessary, and that's the requirement that the cluster API must reconcile. I don't know. I find it hard to imagine a use case which we would disallow by not having that requirement, because I feel like reconciliation is sort of fundamental to the control model of Kubernetes operators. And if you came into the project not knowing about Kubernetes and not knowing about V1 and Alpha 1, you might not have the perspective that we are writing operators. Then you might need to mention that you need to reconcile your desired state with the actual state. To me, like, there's a bunch of conversation in the requirement section about what it means, like how far should an operator go to reconcile, and anyway.
And you're sorry, can you clarify your debate? You're suggesting that we should have the must, or
We should remove the requirement, I think. I mean, we're not having the requirement doesn't stop us from implementing operators. And I don't think we need a requirement that we can then use to back up the decision to use an operator.
It seems like if that unblocks some of the arguments that we can make it a should or something like that, or recommended or consider doing this because it's a good idea, but you can still be cluster API without it type thing.
Yeah, I think I'd be okay removing it. When I originally wrote it, it was an attempt to say something along the lines of, if I have a machine represented in cluster API, and that translates to an EC2 instance, for example, and that EC2 instance gets terminated for whatever reason, I want to make sure that that gets rectified. And so if it's an understanding that, as you said, David, we're doing operators, and that's implicit and inherent to reconciling because it's declarative APIs, and that's the way that this API space works, I think it might be appropriate just to drop it. Because the alternative is, if you're writing an infrastructure provider and there's a machine and the VM goes away, you're going to have an unhappy user if nothing is done to fix that. So I'm okay getting rid of it.
Yeah, and I figure we can catch these things. These things will become more concrete once we have performance tests.
So I'd say, unless there's anything else specifically about this process, I'd turn it back to Jason.
Just a comment, Andy. More than the word, I mean, I think that is probably even more important that relating the use cases to the requirement. That, as you said, anyone who has a use case should take care of that. But as we will actually move or work on the requirements, it will be important to know which use cases this requirement belongs to, just to have a context, It's like there is a requirement, but there is a use case. Sometimes it's not obvious at this stage, and because we are only capturing the initial idea of this requirement. So I don't know how to solve this problem, but In my experience, that's the problem, that you have a requirement, you then don't recall what's the context of that requirement, where this requirement came from, just to allow to refine the requirement in more specific details. So, because we have a bunch of requirements, so and it's something that worries me. I don't know how to solve it, honestly.
I saw Chris do this in a previous requirements doc where she assigned a number, a number to the requirement and then linked them to the use case. So the use case satisfies requirement 1, 2, and 3, whereas related to requirement 1, 2, and 3. Which
that's what I have done also. That's what I used to do also when I do this. But it's harder to do once we have this a lot of work. Mostly because now we need to ask people to do the binding more than the use case to the requirement. Try to look for the requirements and tie to the use case the other way back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so in the old days, we would create a table, and on one side it's use cases, on the other side we list all the requirements. The late number, just like Chuck said. So that's one way we could do it. We can create a table.
Yeah, I think I don't disagree with any of those statements. I think coming up with some way to map the requirements to the use cases is important. So let's find a way that works for everybody. And I don't know that we're going to necessarily solve that right now, though.
Anything else on the goals, requirements, and use case documents? Any other topics before we adjourn for the day? All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.